The courtroom in Spokane County Superior Court was heavy with a tension that had been building for nearly 2 decades. It was October 2025, and the man seated at the defense table, Justin Crenshaw, was no longer the fresh-faced 20-year-old who had terrorized the city in 2008. He was older, his features hardened by years of incarceration, yet the volatility that had defined his youth remained just beneath the surface. This was a resentencing hearing. A procedural door opened by changes in Washington state law regarding youthful offenders, specifically the Monchka decision, which required judges to consider the mitigating factors of youth before mandating life without parole. For the families of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel, this hearing was reopening a wound that had never truly healed, forcing them to relive the horrific details of a crime that defied comprehension. Judge Dean Chuang presided over the proceedings. The defense had argued for leniency, suggesting that the Justin Crenshaw of 2025 was not the same man as the Justin Crenshaw of 2008, and that the impulsivity of youth should grant him a chance at eventual release. The prosecution, however, pointed to the sheer brutality of the acts, the calculated nature of the cover-up, and the irreversible loss of 2 young lives. As Judge Chuang began to read his decision, the air in the room grew still. He acknowledged the legal requirements to consider Crenshaw's age at the time of the murders, but ultimately found that the severity of the crime outweighed the mitigating factors. He reimposed the life sentences. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The mask of the reformed prisoner slipped. Crenshaw, realizing that his bid for freedom had failed, erupted in a display of rage that shocked even those familiar with his history. He lashed out at the judge, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "Don't forget to wipe your ass with that," he screamed, a profane dismissal of the judicial order that had just sealed his fate. The outburst was raw, ugly, and telling. It was a moment that stripped away any pretense of rehabilitation, revealing a glimpse of the same darkness that had descended upon a small duplex on East Broadway Avenue 17 years prior. To understand the magnitude of that outburst, and the chilling lack of remorse it signified, one must return to the winter of 2008, to a snowy morning in Spokane, Washington, where the nightmare began. February in Spokane is often gray and biting, with snow piled high on the curbs and a damp chill that settles into the bones. In 2008, the house at 512 East Broadway Avenue was a hub of youthful energy. It was a duplex, and inside one of the units lived Tanner Pell, a 20-year-old, with a reputation for being a fiercely loyal friend and a protector. Tanner was the kind of young man who seemed to be finding his footing in adulthood, creating a space where friends felt welcome. Among those friends was 18-year-old Sarah Clark. Sarah was vibrant, a former student at Meade High School who worked at a local Zips drive-in. She was known for her infectious laugh and a spirit that drew people to her. She and Tanner shared a close, sibling-like bond, a platonic intimacy born of shared circles and the easy camaraderie of late adolescence. The path that brought Justin Crenshaw into their orbit was paved with the casual, trusting nature of youth. Crenshaw was a drifter, a 20-year-old, originally from Las Vegas, who had arrived in Spokane with little more than the clothes on his back and a series of behavioral red flags that were invisible to those who didn't know where to look. He had been introduced to the group by a mutual acquaintance known as Cheese. To Sarah and Tanner, Crenshaw was just another guy looking for a place to fit in, perhaps a bit odd or intense, but harmless enough. He told stories of his past, presenting himself as a traveler, someone experienced beyond his years. In the days leading up to the end of February, Crenshaw had ingratiated himself into their circle, crashing at the duplex, drinking their beer, and existing in the peripheral vision of their lives. On the night of the 27th of February, 2008, the atmosphere inside the East Broadway home was relaxed. It was a Wednesday, the kind of midweek gathering common among young adults with flexible schedules and few heavy responsibilities. There was music, drinking, and the haziness of a hangout that stretched into the early morning hours. Witnesses who had been there earlier in the evening would later recall nothing particularly alarming. Crenshaw was there, drinking, interacting, seemingly part of the group. But as the night deepened and other guests filtered out, the dynamic inside the house shifted. The circle shrank until it was just the three of them: Tanner, the tenant, Sarah, the close friend, and Justin, the newcomer. The transition from a social gathering to a crime scene did not happen with a shout, but with a sudden, catastrophic violence that remains difficult to reconstruct in its entirety. What is known is that sometime in the pre-dawn hours of February 28, the quiet of the neighborhood was broken not by screams, but by the smell of smoke. At approximately 9 a.m., neighbors spotted wisps of dark smoke curling out from the eaves of the duplex. In a dense residential area like East Broadway, fire is a terrifying prospect, threatening to leap from roof to roof. Emergency services were called immediately. The Spokane Fire Department responded, their sirens cutting through the morning traffic. When the first units from the battalion arrived, they found the structure locked up tight. The smoke was thickening, turning from gray to an oily black, indicating that the fire was starving for oxygen and consuming synthetic materials inside. Firefighters forced entry, expecting a standard residential blaze, perhaps a cooking accident or an electrical fault. They moved low, crawling beneath the thermal layer, their respirators clicking rhythmically. The heat was intense, but the visibility was the primary challenge. As they navigated the living room, sweeping the hose line back and forth to suppress the flames licking up the walls, they began to encounter obstacles that were not furniture. The first body they found was Tanner Peel. He was located near the front door, a position that would later suggest a desperate attempt to escape or confront the threat. But it was not the fire that had killed him. Even in the smoky haze, the first responders could see the devastating trauma. Tanner had been stabbed repeatedly. The violence inflicted upon him was excessive, far beyond what was necessary to subdue a person. It was a frenzied attack. As the firefighters pushed deeper into the home to clear the structure, they found Sarah Clark in a back bedroom. Her condition mirrored Tanner's. She had suffered dozens of stab wounds. The scene was a charnel house, illuminated by the flickering light of the dying fire and the beams of flashlights. But there was a detail in the room that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans of the department. 2 swords, decorative blades that had been kept in the house, were found impaled in the bodies. The theatricality of the cruelty was staggering. It wasn't just a murder, it was a desecration. The perpetrator had used the swords to pin the victims, leaving them as grotesque monuments to his rage. The fire, the investigators would soon realize, was a clumsy attempt to wash away the sins of the night. Accelerants had been splashed around the bodies and the living areas. The killer had hoped the flames would consume the evidence, burning the house to the ground and reducing the bodies to unrecognizable ash. But the house had been sealed too tightly. The fire had choked on its own smoke, smoldering rather than raging, preserving the horror inside for the authorities to find. As the fire was extinguished and the smoke cleared, the property on East Broadway was taped off with yellow crime scene ribbon. Detectives from the Spokane Police Department Major Crimes Unit arrived, stepping into a scene that felt ritualistic in its violence. They began the grim task of processing the evidence. Blood was everywhere, cast off on the walls, pooled on the floor, soaking into the furniture. The sheer number of stab wounds indicated a personal, explosive anger. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an annihilation. They quickly established who lived there and who was supposed to be there. Tanner Peel was the resident. Sarah Clark was the frequent guest. But there was supposed to be a third person staying at the house. A drifter. A guy from Vegas. His name was Justin. Justin Crenshaw was nowhere to be found. Tanner's vehicle, a distinct car known to his friends and family, was also missing from the driveway. The timeline began to coalesce rapidly. The neighbors had seen the car earlier, then it was gone. The fire had started shortly after the vehicle's departure. The police put out an all-points bulletin. They weren't just looking for a person of interest. They were looking for a man who had just butchered 2 people who had offered him shelter. The news rippled through Spokane. 2 young people, well-liked and full of promise, dead in a house fire that was actually a double homicide. The details of the swords leaked out, adding a macabre layer to the tragedy. Parents held their children tighter. The community at Meade High School and the regulars at Zips were in shock. Sarah Clark, who had just been serving burgers and fries with a smile, was gone. Tanner Pell, the guy who would give you the shirt off his back, was dead. In those initial hours, the focus was entirely on the manhunt. Who was Justin Crenshaw? Where was he going? The police learned that Crenshaw had a history of mental instability and violent outbursts, though nothing on his record predicted a double homicide of this magnitude. He was a ticking time bomb that had finally detonated in the living room of 512 East Broadway. Investigators pieced together the movements of the previous night. They interviewed the friends who had left early, the ones who had escaped the slaughter by mere chance. They painted a picture of a normal night that had silently turned deadly. Crenshaw had waited. He had waited until the witnesses were gone, until the defenses were down. The betrayal was absolute. These were not enemies. These were his hosts. As the coroner's vans removed the bodies of Sarah and Tanner, the reality of the loss began to settle over the city. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but the motive remained a dark void. Why? Why kill the people who had taken you in? Why the swords? Why the fire? The narrative of Justin Crenshaw was just beginning to be written in the public consciousness. He was no longer the quiet drifter in the corner of the party. He was a monster who had left a signature of fire and steel. The search for him would not take long, but the journey through the legal system, the fight for justice, and the endurance of the families would span nearly 2 decades. It would lead from that smoky morning in 2008 all the way to a courtroom in 2025, where a judge would refuse to forget, and a killer would scream his defiance, proving that the malice born on East Broadway had not dimmed with time. The investigation turned its eyes toward the roads leading out of Spokane. Crenshaw was in the wind, driving a dead man's car, leaving a trail of grief that would never fully fade. The hunt was on. The identification of Justin Crenshaw did not require a complex forensic puzzle. In the smoking ruins of the house on East Dalton Avenue, amidst the horror of what had been done to Sarah Clark and Tanner Pell, the absence of the 20-year-old drifter was a screaming void. He was the variable that had entered their equation only weeks prior, a figure who had drifted into their lives with tall tales and a charismatic, if unsettled, energy. Now, he was gone. And so was Tanner's vehicle, a silver Acura. The connections were drawn instantly. The friend who had been sleeping on the couch was now the prime suspect in a double homicide of staggering brutality. The manhunt, though intense, was short-lived, spanning state lines but lasting only a matter of days. Crenshaw had not fled into the wilderness to hide. He had driven straight for the neon indulgence of Las Vegas. It was a destination that spoke to his state of mind: escapism, stimulation, and a total disregard for the gravity of the carnage he had left in Spokane. Police in Nevada, alerted to the stolen vehicle and the wanted status of its driver, spotted the Acura. The arrest was executed with swift mechanical precision. There was no shootout, no hostage standoff, merely the clamping of handcuffs on a young man who looked less like a monster and more like a disheveled tourist. When Spokane detectives arrived to interview him, the demeanor of Justin Crenshaw began to paint a picture far more disturbing than the crime scene photos. He did not appear to be a man in the grip of a psychotic break or a fugitive crushed by guilt. He was lucid. He was arrogant. His behavior in those initial hours of custody set the tone for the next 17 years. He spoke of the events with a detachment that chilled the investigators, a clinical separation from the violence he had inflicted with swords and fire. The why remained an abyss, a volatile mix of perceived slights, swift rage, and a fundamental lack of empathy. But the who was now securely in a cell. The legal process that followed in 2008 and led to his trial in 2010 was a grim procession for the families of Sarah and Tanner. They sat in the gallery, forced to listen to the medical examiners detail the dozens of stab wounds, the defensive injuries that proved their children had fought for their lives, and the arson that had been intended to erase them. Crenshaw's defense team grappled with the overwhelming physical evidence, but the jury's task was clear. In 2010, Justin Crenshaw was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory and absolute: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the city of Spokane, and specifically for the Clark and Peel families. The gavel's bang in 2010 marked the end of the narrative. The monster was locked away. The key was thrown away. There would be no parole board hearings, no chance of release, no future dates to dread. Justice, in its harshest and most final form, had been served. Crenshaw was transported to the Washington State Penitentiary, a young man of 22 destined to grow old and die within concrete walls. The silence of the prison cell replaced the chaos of the crime. Years turned into a decade. The families tried to rebuild around the holes left in their lives. Memorials were held, birthdays were mourned, and the name Justin Crenshaw began to fade from the daily headlines, existing only as a scar on the city's history. However, inside the legal system, tectonic plates were shifting. The understanding of adolescent brain development was evolving, and with it, the constitutional interpretation of culpability for young offenders. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles, those under 18, was unconstitutional. It was a landmark decision based on the science that the teenage brain is not fully formed, particularly in areas of impulse control and consequence appreciation. This ruling, initially, did not apply to Crenshaw, who had been 20 years old at the time of the murders. He was an adult in the eyes of the law, fully responsible for his actions. But the legal tide in Washington state continued to rise. Defense attorneys and civil rights advocates argued that the scientific principles behind Miller did not magically expire on a person's 18th birthday. Brain development, they contended, continued well into the mid-20s. In a controversial and sweeping decision known as Monschke, the Washington State Supreme Court expanded the protections. They ruled that sentencing courts must consider the mitigating qualities of youth immaturity, impetuosity, and failure to appreciate risks, even for defendants aged 18 to 20. This ruling shattered the finality of the 2010 verdict. Mandatory life without parole for this age group was struck down. Every offender in this category, regardless of the brutality of their crime, was entitled to a resentencing hearing. They were not guaranteed release, but they were guaranteed the chance to argue for it. They were entitled to a judge who would look at them not just as killers, but as youthful offenders whose brains might not have been fully wired. For the families of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel, the news was a devastating shockwave. The wound, which had scabbed over but never truly healed, was ripped open. The certainty of life without parole had been their anchor. Now, they were told that the man who had stabbed their children and set them on fire was coming back to Spokane. He would be in a courtroom again. He would have a voice again. The build-up to the October 2025 hearing was a slow-motion torture. The abstract legal arguments about neurodevelopment and mitigating factors felt like insults to the visceral reality of the double murder. The families had to prepare victim impact statements again, forced to articulate 17 years of loss. They had to steel themselves to see Crenshaw, now a man nearing 40, and listen to his lawyers paint him as a victim of his own biology. Crenshaw, meanwhile, had spent his time in prison preparing for this moment. The resentencing hearing was his singular opportunity. To walk out of prison, he needed to prove more than just good behavior. He needed to prove that the crime reflected transient immaturity rather than irreparable corruption. He had to convince a judge that the 20-year-old who slaughtered his friends was a different entity from the 37-year-old standing before the bench. Reports were commissioned. Psychological evaluations were conducted. The defense strategy was to highlight his difficult upbringing, his substance abuse issues at the time, and his lack of violent infractions while incarcerated. As October 2025 arrived, the atmosphere in the Spokane County Courthouse was heavy with a specific kind of dread. The community had not forgotten the details of the 2008 murders. The image of the burning house was still vivid in the local memory. Extra security was in place. Media outlets, sensing the tension of a high-profile resentencing, gathered to document the outcome. This was one of the test cases for the new law, a litmus test for how much mercy the system was willing to extend to the most violent of offenders. Inside the courtroom, The dynamic was stark. On one side sat the Clark and Pell families, a unified front of grief and rigid anger. They wore buttons with photos of Sarah and Tanner. They held hands, their knuckles white, bracing for the defense's narrative. On the other side sat Justin Crenshaw. He was heavier now, the hollow cheeks of his drug-using days filled out by nearly 2 decades of prison food. He wore the standard inmate uniform, but his posture was attentive. He engaged with his attorneys, nodding at documents, appearing for all the world like a reformed man, engaging in a civic process. The hearing itself was a marathon of emotional extremes. The defense presented their case for leniency with methodical precision. They argued that the Justin Crenshaw of 2008 was a damaged child in an adult's body, driven by impulses he could not control. They pointed to his clean disciplinary record in recent years as proof of his capacity for change. They asked the court to impose a determinate sentence, a specific number of years that would allow him to see freedom again, perhaps in his 50s or 60s. They spoke of redemption and the capacity of the human spirit to evolve. Then came the prosecution. They did not speak of brains or biology. They spoke of blood. They walked the court through the night of the 28th of February, 2008, hour by hour. They reminded Judge Dean Chuang of the choices Crenshaw had made, not impulsive flashes of anger, but sustained intimate violence. They detailed the number of stab wounds. They described the use of the swords, a choice that required specific intent. They recounted the lighting of the fire, a calculated act of concealment that showed a sophisticated, self-preservationist mindset, not the confusion of a child. The prosecutor argued that while the law required the court to consider his youth, it did not require the court to ignore the nature of the evil. Some crimes, the prosecutor stated, looking directly at Crenshaw, are so heinous that they defy the concept of rehabilitation. Some actions are permanent. The sentence should match the permanence of the loss. When the families were given their chance to speak, the courtroom fell into a pin-drop silence. Mothers and fathers, older now than they were during the first trial, took the podium. Their voices trembled not with nervousness, but with the vibration of suppressed rage. They spoke of the empty chairs at Thanksgiving, the grandchildren that were never born, the milestones that Sarah and Tanner never reached. They rejected the narrative of the youthful offender. They saw only the man who had betrayed friendship for slaughter. They pleaded with Judge Chuang to reimpose the life sentences, to keep the lock turned, to grant them the peace of knowing he would never walk the streets of Spokane again. Crenshaw sat through it all. At times he looked down. At times he looked straight ahead. His expression was difficult to read. Was it stoicism? Was it boredom? Or was it the masking of a predator calculating his odds? When he was given the opportunity to speak, he offered words that checked the boxes of remorse. He apologized. He acknowledged the pain. But to the families watching his eyes, the words felt rehearsed, a script generated to unlock a door rather than a confession of the soul. The arguments concluded. The evidence was submitted. The weight of the decision now rested entirely on the shoulders of Judge Dean Chuang. This was not a jury trial. It was a bench decision. One man would decide if Justin Crenshaw died in prison or walked free. The judge took time to review the files, the new psychological reports, and the victim impact statements. The tension in the courtroom during the recess was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed, but the heat of 17 years of waiting made the room stifle. When Judge Chuang returned to the bench to deliver his ruling, the rustling stopped. Deputies moved slightly closer to the defendant's table, a standard protocol that suddenly felt prescient. The judge began to speak, outlining the legal framework he was bound to follow. He acknowledged the Monchka ruling. He acknowledged the science of brain development. He validated the defense's argument that youth is a mitigating factor. Crenshaw leaned forward slightly. The defense table seemed to hold its breath. The judge's preamble sounded like the setup for leniency. He was checking off the requirements of the higher court, proving he had considered every angle of the defendant's age. But then, the tone shifted. Judge Chuang pivoted from the abstract to the specific. He began to describe the murders again. He spoke of the extraordinary cruelty exhibited by Crenshaw. He noted that while impulse control might be undeveloped in a 20-year-old, the acts committed that night displayed a level of depravity that transcended immaturity. He spoke of the betrayal of trust-killing friends who had offered him shelter. He characterized the crime not as a mistake of youth, but as a manifestation of character. The hope in the defense corner began to evaporate. The families on the other side dared not breathe, their eyes fixed on the judge's lips. Judge Chuang looked up from his notes. He addressed the courtroom with finality. He stated that despite the mitigating factors of youth, the severity of the crime and the need for public safety outweighed them. He found that Justin Crenshaw was not merely a wayward youth, but a dangerously violent individual whose rehabilitation could never be guaranteed. "The court reimposes the sentence," Judge Chuang announced, his voice steady and devoid of hesitation. Count 1. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Count 2. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air for a split second. The families let out a collective, ragged exhale, a sound of immense physical release. The legal journey, the reopening of the wounds, the fear of his release, it was over. The system had bent, but it had not broken. The original justice stood. In the defendant's chair, the mask of the reformed, polite inmate dissolved. The facade of the youthful offender, who had just wanted a second chance, vanished in the span of a heartbeat. The reality of the decision that he would die in a cage, that his 17 years of maneuvering had amounted to nothing, hit Justin Crenshaw with the force of a physical blow. The courtroom, prepared for a solemn dismissal, was about to witness the true nature of the man who had sat silently for hours. The buildup was over. The explosion was imminent. To understand the fury that erupted in the courtroom in 2025, one must strip away the years of legal maneuvering and return to the silence of the house where the timeline fractured. The outburst of a 37-year-old man facing life in prison was loud and chaotic, but the events that sealed his fate were marked by a terrifying, methodical quiet. It was late February, 2008, Spokane, Washington. The winter air was biting, the kind of cold that drove people indoors to seek the warmth of shared spaces and alcohol. On the evening of February 27, the interactions between Justin Crenshaw, Tanner Peele, and Sarah Clark appeared indistinguishable from the typical social rhythms of young adults. There was no shouting, no public altercation, and no obvious predator stalking his prey. Instead, there was an invitation. Tanner Peele, 20 years old and known for his easygoing nature and culinary aspirations, had the keys to his mother's home at 512 East Elm Street. His mother and brother were away, leaving the single-story residence empty, a perfect venue for a private gathering. Tanner had recently befriended Crenshaw, a newcomer to Spokane from Las Vegas who had been working with him at a local steakhouse. Crenshaw, also 20, projected the image of a drifter looking for connection, a young man trying to find his footing in a new city. Sarah Clark, just 18 and weeks away from her high school graduation, joined them. She was a friend of the group, driving her white vehicle to ferry the trio from an earlier gathering at an apartment to the privacy of the Peele residence. The shift from a casual hangout to a crime scene began around 11 p.m. Neighbors later reported seeing Sarah's white car arrive at the Elm Street house. The group settled in. The house was comfortable, filled with the personal artifacts of the Peele family, framed photographs on the walls, furniture arranged for family living, a kitchen stocked with the tools Tanner used for his cooking. For the next several hours, the three drank. Alcohol flowed freely, a detail Crenshaw would later weaponize in his defense, claiming a pathological intoxication that divorced him from his actions. However, the forensic evidence gathered later would tell a story not of blackout-induced chaos, but of precision. Sometime in the early morning hours of February 28, the atmosphere inside the house curdled. The exact trigger remains locked in the mind of the perpetrator, but the physical reality of what followed was meticulously documented by investigators. The violence did not begin with a firearm or a sudden impersonal act. It began with intimacy and proximity. Crenshaw armed himself. He did not use a weapon he had brought with him. Instead, he turned the domestic environment against his hosts. He accessed the kitchen, selecting a knife. At some point, he also located a set of decorative swords kept in the home, items that were meant for display but became instruments of an atrocity that shocked even veteran detectives. The attack on Sarah Clark was prolonged and savage. She was found in one of the bedrooms, a space that offered no sanctuary. The autopsy revealed the sheer intensity of the assault. She had been stabbed 26 times. The wounds were not random slashes, but were clustered with lethal intent. Many were directed at her head, neck, and upper torso, indicating a desire not just to incapacitate but to destroy. The medical examiner would later note the presence of defensive wounds, signaling that Sarah had fought for her life, aware of the horror unfolding before her. The finality of the violence was punctuated by a samurai sword, which was driven through her neck with such force that it remained embedded in her body when authorities arrived. Her throat had been slit, a distinct injury separate from the barrage of stab wounds, suggesting a methodical conclusion to the struggle. Tanner Peele met a similarly gruesome end. The physical evidence suggested he was attacked in the living area, perhaps attempting to intervene or caught off guard by the sudden turn in his new friend's demeanor. Tanner sustained more than a dozen stab wounds, the blade piercing vital organs and leaving him incapacitated on the floor of his childhood home. Like Sarah, Tanner was not just killed, he was displayed. A broadsword was rammed through his chest, pinning his body to the floorboards. The visual tableau created by the killer was grotesque, transcending simple homicide and entering the realm of ritualistic desecration. The timeline of the violence correlates with a neighbor's account. Around 3:40 a.m., a resident nearby heard terrified screams piercing the quiet of the neighborhood. The screams were brief, quickly swallowed by the night, and no law enforcement was summoned immediately. Inside 512 East Elm Street, the screaming had stopped, but the killer's work was not finished. With two bodies cooling on the floor, Crenshaw did not flee in a panic. He lingered. The crime scene photographs depicted a chilling level of composure in the aftermath of the butchery. Family photographs that had hung on the walls were removed. They were not smashed or thrown, but methodically placed upside down. This bizarre inversion of the home's normalcy suggested a psychological break, a symbolic overturning of the order that had existed within the house. The house was soaked in blood. It pooled on the laminate, soaked into the carpets, and splattered the walls, marking the radius of the struggles. Crenshaw, covered in the evidence of his actions, moved through the residence. He needed to obscure the timeline and destroy the forensic roadmap he had created. He gathered materials to start a fire. The arson was not a singular attempt, but a strategic effort to consume the house. He ignited the blaze, hoping the flames would devour the bodies, the swords, and the blood. The fire began to eat at the structure, the smoke slowly filling the rooms where Sarah and Tanner lay impaled. Crenshaw then prepared to leave. He took the keys to Sarah Clark's white car. He did not run into the night on foot. He drove away in the vehicle of the woman he had just butchered, leaving the house on Elm Street to burn. His exit was as calculated as the murders. He drove to the home of his aunt, where he had been staying, carrying with him the clothes saturated with the blood of his victims. Upon arriving at his aunt's residence in North Spokane, he did not confess or collapse. He acted with self-preservation. He stripped off his bloody garments, a pair of jeans, a shirt, and his shoes, and stuffed them into a plastic bag. This bag was then hidden in a plastic bin in the garage, a concealment effort that would eventually fail, but which demonstrated a clear awareness of guilt. He cleaned himself up, washing away the biological traces of the night, and prepared a cover story. Back on Elm Street, the fire failed to achieve its total purpose. It smoldered and burned, but it did not incinerate the house completely before emergency services were alerted. Firefighters arriving at the scene expected a routine structure fire. What they found as they pushed through the smoke was a slaughterhouse. The heat had been intense, but the bodies were intact enough to reveal the swords jutting from them, a sight that signaled immediate criminal investigation rather than accidental tragedy. The discovery of the bodies halted the firefighting operation's standard protocol. The residence was sealed off. Crime scene technicians, clad in protective suits, stepped into the waterlogged and smoke-damaged home. They navigated around the overturned pictures and the soot-covered furniture to document the angle of the swords and the distribution of the blood. The contrast was stark. The mundane setting of a family home clashed violently with the medieval brutality of the weapons used. In the hours following the murders, while detectives began the grim task of identifying the victims and tracing their last movements, Crenshaw attempted to blend back into the world. He went to a grocery store. He was seen with scratches and marks on his person, injuries sustained during the desperate final struggles of Sarah and Tanner. When asked about them, he lied, crafting a narrative about a fight with strangers, a story easily disproven but sufficient to deflect immediate suspicion from casual observers. The brutality of the crime, the use of swords, the high number of stab wounds, the staging of the photos, and the arson spoke of a rage that went beyond a drunken mistake. It was personal, visceral, and prolonged. The drifter, who had been welcomed into the home, had dismantled it from the inside out. As the sun rose over Spokane on February 28, the magnitude of the loss began to ripple outward. Two families were waking up to a day that would end with the knock on the door that every parent fears. The investigation moved rapidly. The connection between the victims and the new guy in town, Justin, was established quickly by friends who knew they had been hanging out. The timeline was reconstructed. The arrival at 11 p.m., the screams at 3:40 a.m., the fire shortly after. When police eventually located Crenshaw, the facade of the confused, intoxicated young man began to crumble under the weight of physical evidence. The bloody clothes in the garage, the possession of Sarah's car, and the injuries on his own body created a chain of custody that linked him directly to the horror at 512 East Elm Street. The crime itself was a closed loop of violence that lasted only a few hours, yet it contained enough malice to justify the original life sentences. It was this specific sequence of events, the betrayal of hospitality, the torture of two young adults, and the callous attempt to burn them to ash, that Judge Chuang had in mind 17 years later. When Crenshaw stood in court in 2025, shouting profanities and demanding his defiance be noted, the room did not see a reformed man. They saw the shadow of the 20-year-old who had driven a sword through a woman's neck and left her to burn. The crime was not just a historical fact. It was the enduring reality that no resentencing hearing could erase. The details of that night in February 2008 remained as sharp and jagged as the weapons found in the ashes. The morning of the 28th of February, 2008, broke over the quiet residential neighborhood of Meade, just outside the city limits of Spokane, Washington, with a chilling stillness that belied the violence of the preceding hours. At approximately 9:30 a.m., a neighbor noticed thick, gray smoke billowing from the split-level home at 512 East Elm Street. The structure, usually a hub of youthful energy and social gatherings, was silent except for the crackling of the developing fire. The neighbor immediately dialed 911, reporting a residential structure fire, unaware that the flames were merely a curtain meant to obscure a far darker tragedy. Firefighters from Spokane County Fire District 9 were the first responders on the scene. Upon arrival, they observed smoke venting from the upper levels of the house. Following standard protocol, they geared up for a potential rescue operation, breaching the front entrance to combat the blaze and search for occupants. The heat was intense, but the fire had not yet fully consumed the structure. Visibility was poor, forcing the firefighters to navigate by touch and thermal imaging. As they moved through the haze, sweeping the living areas and bedrooms, their mission shifted instantly from fire suppression to crime scene preservation. In two separate rooms, firefighters discovered the bodies of a male and a female. It was immediately apparent that their deaths were not the result of smoke inhalation or thermal burns. The condition of the victims was catastrophic, stopping the first responders in their tracks. The fire captain immediately ordered a withdrawal to minimize scene contamination and contacted the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. The investigation was no longer about a house fire. It was a double homicide investigation. Major crimes detectives arrived to find a scene that veteran officers would later describe as one of the most gruesome in Spokane's history. The fire had been set intentionally, a crude attempt at arson designed to destroy forensic evidence, but the flames had failed to reach the temperatures necessary to incinerate the bodies or the biological traces left behind by the perpetrator. The heat had damaged the home, but the story of the night remained legible in the blood spatter and the positioning of the victims. Detectives began the grim task of processing the scene. In one room lay 2 0-year-old Tanner Peel. In another was 1 8-year-old Sarah Clark. The violence inflicted upon them was not swift. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment at the scene, later confirmed by autopsy, revealed a level of overkill that suggested deep-seated rage or a complete psychotic break. Both victims had been stabbed repeatedly, suffering dozens of wounds. The brutality was specific and personal. This was not a robbery gone wrong where a thief panicked and fired a gun. This was close contact, prolonged violence. The weapons used were found within the residence, turning the home's own contents against its occupants. Investigators located samurai-style swords, which had been displayed in the house, now stained with blood and abandoned amidst the carnage. The perpetrator had used these blades to impale the bodies, leaving them in a state of desecration that deeply disturbed even the most seasoned forensic technicians. The use of the swords added a macabre layer to the crime, indicating that the killer had improvised with what was available, escalating the violence as the attack progressed. While forensic teams meticulously photographed the blood trails and collected samples from the unburned sections of the floor, detectives turned their attention to the timeline. They needed to establish who had been in the house the previous night. The residence was known for hosting social gatherings, and the evening of February 27 had been no different. Empty beer cans and the general disarray of a party provided the first clues. By interviewing neighbors and friends who had been at the house earlier that evening, a picture of the guest list began to emerge. Witnesses described a small gathering. Tanner Peel and Sarah Clark were there, along with a few others who had left as the night wore on. Crucially, the witnesses consistently mentioned a new face, a young man who was not part of their core circle, but had been brought along by a mutual acquaintance. They knew him only as Justin. He was described as a drifter, someone who had recently arrived in town from Las Vegas and was staying with Chelsea, a friend of the group. Interviews with Chelsea proved pivotal. She confirmed that she had brought Justin Crenshaw to the party. She described his behavior earlier in the night as odd but not immediately threatening, though he had a history of intense mood swings and behavioral issues. She told detectives that she had left the party around 3:30 a.m., leaving Crenshaw behind at the Elm Street house with Tanner and Sarah. At that time, everyone was alive. The atmosphere had been relaxed. Crenshaw was the last known person to see them alive, and he was now nowhere to be found. The investigation quickly pivoted to a manhunt. The absence of Sarah Clark's vehicle, a 2008 Honda, from the driveway provided the immediate vector for the suspect's flight. Police issued a crucial bulletin for the missing car, broadening the search radius beyond Spokane County. They weren't just looking for a witness. They were tracking a suspect who had allegedly just committed a double homicide and arson. Detectives scrutinized Crenshaw's background, uncovering a troubled history that spanned multiple states. At only 20 years old, he had already accumulated a record of erratic behavior and minor offenses, but nothing that explicitly predicted the explosion of violence found on Elm Street. However, the psychological profile developing in the precinct suggested an individual with a severe lack of impulse control and a detachment from the consequences of his actions. The overkill nature of the stabbings, dozens of wounds inflicted on defenseless friends, pointed to a suspect who did not just want to kill, but wanted to destroy. As the day pressed on, the focus shifted to digital and financial tracking. In 2008, the digital footprint of a drifter was smaller than in the modern era, but credit card usage and cell phone pings remained vital tools. Investigators monitored the financial activity associated with the victims, looking for any sign that the killer was funding his escape with their money. This electronic trail, combined with the description of the stolen Honda, began to narrow the search. The trail did not lead west toward the coast, but east, crossing the state line into the Idaho Panhandle. It was a route often taken by those fleeing Spokane heading into the rugged, more isolated terrain of the Silver Valley. Law enforcement agencies in Idaho were alerted to the presence of the stolen vehicle and the description of Justin Crenshaw. The distinct geography of the region, defined by Interstate 90 cutting through narrow valleys, limited the escape routes available to a fugitive in a vehicle. Information regarding the stolen vehicle eventually pinged in Wallace, Idaho, a historic mining town nestled deep in the mountains, roughly 80 miles east of the crime scene. The Shoshone County Sheriff's Office mobilized quickly upon receiving the tip. The vehicle was located, confirming that the suspect was likely still in the immediate vicinity. Unlike a fugitive who continues to run until the gas runs out, Crenshaw had stopped. The arrest itself was anticlimactic compared to the ferocity of the crime. Law enforcement officers located Justin Crenshaw in Wallace later that same day. He was not barricaded in a motel room with an arsenal, nor did he engage in a high-speed pursuit. He was apprehended with relative ease. However, his demeanor upon contact with the police was unsettling. Officers noted a strange calmness, a lack of the frantic energy typically seen in suspects who have just butchered two people and fled across state lines. He did not seem like a man haunted by the screams of his victims or the smell of burning wreckage. Once in custody, the physical reality of the crime remained clinging to him, creating the bridge between the smoking ruins in Meade and the jail cell in Idaho. While the specific evidentiary items found in his possession were being cataloged for the warrant, the investigators focused on his reactions. He appeared detached, almost bored. The disconnect between his affect and the gruesome reality of the photos detectives were now reviewing back in Spokane was stark. The detectives from Spokane traveled to Idaho to conduct the initial interviews and oversee the extradition process. They were armed with the timeline constructed from the surviving partygoers. Crenshaw was the guest who wouldn't leave, the outlier who remained after the close friends had gone home or to bed. The window of opportunity was narrow between Chelsea's departure at 3:30 a.m. and the neighbor's 9:30 a.m. call, and Crenshaw was the only variable that fit. Back at 512 East Elm Street, the crime scene unit continued their work for days. They mapped the trajectory of the attack, determining that the violence had likely started in the living areas before ending in the bedrooms. They analyzed the burn patterns, confirming that accelerants had been used in specific locations to maximize damage, a calculated effort to erase the timeline. The failure of the fire to consume the house was a stroke of luck for justice, preserving the biological map of the massacre. The swords were bagged and tagged, their blades telling a story of distinct, frenzied strikes. The sheer number of wounds on Tanner and Sarah required hours of documentation by the medical examiner. This was not a quick death. It was a torture session, followed by an execution. The investigation concluded that the victims had likely been taken by surprise, betrayed by the guests they had welcomed into their home. As Crenshaw was transported back to Washington State to face charges, the narrative of the investigation solidified. It was not a mystery of who for very long. It was a rapid assembly of undeniable facts. The last man seen, the stolen transport, and the trail of physical evidence leading directly to Wallace. The detectives had their man, but the question of why remained a dark void. There was no argument, no lover's quarrel, no gang dispute. There was only a night of hanging out that descended into a bloodbath. The gathered evidence was sufficient to charge Justin Crenshaw with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The prosector's case was built on the seamless integration of witness testimony, placing him at the scene, and the forensic trail he carved all the way to Idaho. The community of Meade was left reeling, the charred house standing as a grim monument to the randomness of the violence. 2 young lives had been extinguished by a drifter they had tried to befriend, a man whose only response to their hospitality was the blade of a sword and the strike of a match. This airtight investigative work laid the foundation for the initial conviction in 2010, ensuring that the man who looked at the judge with such contempt years later would have no escape route from the truth of what he had done. The investigation into the double homicide at the residence on East Farwell Road began while the structure was still smoldering. Firefighters had suppressed the blaze, but the scene they left for detectives was a chaotic mixture of water damage, soot, and the distinct acrid smell of accelerant that signaled arson. The fire had been set with purpose, intended to erase the timeline of the night, but the physical evidence remained stubbornly intact. Investigators from the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, working alongside fire marshals, began the meticulous process of deconstructing the crime scene layer by layer. The house itself told a story of sudden, explosive violence that contradicted the suspect's later claims of a hazy blackout. The point of origin for the fire was identified relatively quickly. Pore patterns were visible on the floorboards, indicating where a flammable liquid, determined to be gasoline, had been splashed throughout the living areas and near the bodies. The arsonist had not been subtle. The attempt to destroy the house was desperate and disorganized, leaving behind crucial clues that a more calculated offender might have obscured. In the kitchen and hallway, the signs of a struggle were preserved under the layer of ash. Blood spatter that had not been consumed by the flames told analysts where the attacks had begun and how the victims had moved or been moved during the assault. The recovery of the bodies provided the most harrowing evidence of the killer's mindset. Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel had not merely been killed, they had been obliterated. The medical examiner's report would later serve as the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument for aggravated circumstances. The autopsies revealed that the victims suffered dozens of stab wounds, a quantity that far exceeded what was necessary to cause death. This was overkill, a forensic term indicating extreme rage or a psychopathic detachment from the reality of the inflicting pain. The weapons used were distinct and horrifyingly specific to the location. 2 samurai-style swords, which had been displayed in the home, were identified as the murder weapons. The blade of one sword was found bent, a testament to the sheer force used during the thrusting motions. In a detail that sickened even seasoned investigators, one of the swords had been left impaled through one of the bodies, pinning the victim to the floor. This was not a crime of self-defense or a panic-induced accident. It was a theatrical display of dominance and cruelty. The lack of defensive wounds on the suspect, compared to the severe trauma on the victims, suggested a surprise attack or an ambush within the trusted circle of friends. While the forensic team processed the grim tableau in Meade, the hunt for Justin Crenshaw provided its own trail of evidence. His flight from the scene was not the calculated disappearance of a master criminal, but the erratic run of an impulsive killer. The vehicle missing from the driveway, a car belonging to Tanner Pell, became a rolling beacon for law enforcement. Crenshaw had not just taken a life, he had taken property, adding robbery to the list of potential charges. His movements were tracked across the state line into Idaho, creating a digital and eyewitness footprint that prosecutors would later map out for the jury. In Coeur d'Alene, less than an hour's drive from the smoking ruin of the crime scene, Crenshaw's behavior provided a psychological snapshot of his state of mind immediately following the murders. He did not go into hiding. Instead, he sought out acquaintances and public spaces. Witnesses who encountered him in the hours after the killings described a man who was agitated but functional. He purchased beer. He spoke to people. He possessed Tanner Peel's credit cards and vehicle, treating them as his own spoils. This behavior undermined any potential defense of insanity or fugue state. He was rational enough to drive, rational enough to transact commerce, and rational enough to flee the jurisdiction. The arrest itself yielded the smoking gun needed to tie the forensic knot. When law enforcement apprehended Crenshaw, he was still in possession of the stolen vehicle. More damning was the biological evidence he carried on his person. His clothing was stained with blood. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed that the blood did not belong to Crenshaw, but was a mixture matching the genetic profiles of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel. In 2008, DNA technology was advanced enough to provide probability statistics in the quadrillions, making it a mathematical certainty that the biological material on the suspect's genes came from the victims he had left in the burning house. Beyond the blood and the stolen car, the contents of his pockets and the vehicle offered further incrimination. Detectives found items taken from the house, trinkets, and personal effects that served no survival purpose but acted as trophies of the night. This suggested a motive that went beyond simple anger. It pointed toward a predatory entitlement. He felt entitled to their lives, and subsequently entitled to their possessions. The interrogation room provided the final layer of evidentiary mortar. Crenshaw's statements to detectives were a maze of deflections and partial admissions. He alluded to a monster inside him, a dissociative entity that took control. However, the details he provided, and the ones he conveniently omitted, did not align with a true psychotic break. He remembered enough to drive to Idaho. He remembered enough to try to burn the evidence. A true dissociative episode rarely allows for such selective memory and organized cleanup efforts. Police interview techniques exposed these inconsistencies. When pressed on the specifics of the fire, his answers wavered. When confronted with the brutality of the sword attacks, his demeanor shifted between apathy and frustration. The prosecution also began compiling a history of Crenshaw's behavioral issues to establish a pattern of escalation. While the defense would later try to leverage his troubled upbringing and youth as mitigating factors, the state viewed his history as evidence of ingrained antisocial personality traits. Reports from previous institutional encounters painted a picture of a young man who struggled with impulse control and lacked empathy traits that culminated tragically on that night in February. The leap from behavioral issues to double homicide was vast, but the forensic bridge connecting them was solid. Crucially, the timeline reconstruction destroyed the possibility of a heat of passion defense. Witnesses who had been with the group earlier in the evening described a normal social gathering. There was no reports of a violent argument, no shouting match that got out of hand. The violence appeared to have been unilateral and unprovoked. The transition from hanging out to massacre happened entirely within Crenshaw's control. The fact that he used weapons of opportunity found in the house rather than bringing a weapon with him might have suggested impulsivity initially, but the systematic nature of the killing, attacking two people, ensuring they were dead, and then methodically spreading gasoline required a sustained intent that legally constituted premeditation. The arson investigation concluded that the fire was set in multiple locations, a tactic known as redundancy in fire science. If one fire failed to catch, another would ensure destruction. This finding was critical. A person in a panic might drop a match and run. A person intent on destroying evidence moves from room to room, ensuring the accelerant is properly distributed. This specific piece of evidence spoke to a clarity of mind that was devastating to the defense's narrative of a boy who lost control. He had not lost control. He had taken control of the environment to serve his own ends. As the case moved toward trial, the physical evidence was overwhelming. The swords with the victim's blood and tissue, the bent blades, the gasoline residue on Crenshaw's shoes, the stolen car, the DNA, and the eyewitness accounts from Idaho formed an unassailable wall of facts. The defense would be left with little room to maneuver regarding the factual guilt of Justin Crenshaw. They could not argue he wasn't there. They could not argue he didn't do it. The evidence forced them into the corner of arguing about his mental state, a subjective battleground that the cold, hard facts of the crime scene had already largely preempted. The sheer volume of stab wounds remained the most visceral piece of evidence the jury would eventually face. In a courtroom setting, seeing the photos of the bent swords and the charred interior of the home would bring the horror of those final moments to life. The medical examiner's testimony would catalog every injury, painting a picture of a prolonged, terrifying assault where the victims had no chance of survival. This was not a quick death. It was a torture session followed by an inferno. The silent testimony of the bodies spoke louder than any character witness the defense could summon. By the time the prosecution filed the formal charges, the narrative was locked in. It was a story written in blood and ash, verified by science, and corroborated by the suspect's own actions. The investigation had moved efficiently from the chaos of a fire scene to the sterile certainty of a forensic laboratory. They had the weapon, they had the motive, however twisted it might be, and they had the man. The community of Meade, still reeling from the loss of two young lives, looked to the legal system to translate this mountain of evidence into a verdict that would ensure Justin Crenshaw never walked free again. The file was thick, the details were gruesome, and the conclusion was inescapable. This was a crime of rare and specific evil. The transition from the scorched crime scene to the sterile environment of the Spokane County Superior Court did nothing to dampen the horrifying nature of the evidence against Justin Crenshaw. By the time the trial commenced in July 2010, the community was demanding answers that the legal process struggled to provide. The prosecution, led by seasoned attorneys who had cataloged every stab wound and every burn mark, presented a case that was methodically unassailable. They argued that Crenshaw's actions were not the result of a chaotic, mindless frenzy, but the calculated maneuvers of a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to the specificity of the violence, the use of swords found within the home, the deliberate positioning of the bodies, and the distinct choice to set a fire to destroy forensic traces. These were the actions of a man attempting to evade capture, a consciousness of guilt that permeated every decision he made in the hours following the murders. Crenshaw's defense team faced an almost insurmountable task. With the physical evidence linking their client to the butchery of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel being irrefutable, they could not argue that he did not commit the acts. Instead, they relied on a psychiatric defense, pivoting to a theory of pathological intoxication. The defense argued that Crenshaw suffered from a rare reaction to alcohol, a condition that triggered a blackout state wherein he lost all control and memory of his actions. They painted a picture of a 20-year-old with a troubled history and a broken mind, a young man who had effectively been possessed by a chemical reaction rather than malice. To the jury, they suggested that the Justin Crenshaw sitting at the defense table was distinct from the entity that had rampaged through the house on East Broadway Avenue. The jury, however, was unconvinced by the narrative of a dissociation so severe it excused double homicide. The prosecution dismantled the pathological intoxication theory by highlighting the sophisticated nature of Crenshaw's escape. A man in a blackout state does not typically have the presence of mind to locate car keys, steal credit cards, navigate the interstate system, and flee hundreds of miles to Las Vegas. The flight to Nevada was framed as the ultimate proof of sanity. It demonstrated a clear, linear thought process. I have committed a crime. I must leave. I need resources to survive. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning their verdict. On the 27th of July 2010, Justin Crenshaw was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The sentencing phase in 2010 was a foregone conclusion under the laws of the time. The aggravating factors, multiple victims, and the arson mandated a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no room for negotiation, no sliding scale for age or background. The judge imposed the sentence, effectively sealing Crenshaw in the Washington State Penitentiary system until death. For the families of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel, it was the closing of a chapter, a guarantee that the man who had stolen their children's futures would never breathe free air again. The case faded from the headlines, relegated to the archives of Spokane's darkest criminal histories. However, the legal landscape regarding youthful offenders began to shift in the years that followed. Washington State's appellate courts, following trends in the United States Supreme Court, began to reevaluate the constitutionality of mandatory life sentences for young adults. The courts increasingly accepted neuroscientific evidence, suggesting that the human brain, specifically the areas controlling impulse and consequence evaluation, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. In a landmark decision known as Monchke, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that judges must have the discretion to consider the age and maturity of defendants between the ages of 18 and 20 before imposing life without parole. This ruling acted as a retroactive key for dozens of inmates, including Justin Crenshaw. In 2025, over 17 years after the murders, the families of the victims were forced to return to the courtroom. The wounds that had slowly begun to scar over were ripped open as Crenshaw was granted a resentencing hearing. The premise of the hearing was to determine whether his youth at the time of the murders, he was 20 years and 22 days old, should mitigate his culpability enough to allow for a chance at parole. The burden was on the defense to prove that the crimes were the result of transient immaturity rather than irreparable corruption. The hearing in October 2025 was a tense, emotionally charged affair. Judge Dean Chuang presided over the proceedings, tasked with weighing the gruesome reality of the 2008 murders against the theoretical potential for rehabilitation. Crenshaw's defense team presented a narrative of reform. They argued that the man standing before the court was no longer the impulsive, alcohol-abusing drifter who had committed the crimes. They cited his disciplinary record in prison and the neurological science that underpinned the Monchka ruling, asking the court to grant a determinate sentence that would eventually allow him to see the outside world. The prosecution, conversely, argued that the brutality of the crime transcended the leniency of the new laws. They reiterated the details that had horrified the jury in 2010, the sheer number of stab wounds, the impalement, and the callousness of eating pizza while his victims lay dead or dying, followed by the arson. They argued that some crimes are so heinous that they permanently forfeit the right to freedom, regardless of the perpetrator's age, by a matter of months. They contended that Crenshaw's actions were not merely immature mistakes, but the manifestation of a deep-seated, permanent danger to society. The most powerful testimony came from the families. They stood before Judge Chuang and articulated the void that had existed in their lives for nearly 2 decades. They spoke of graduations missed, weddings that never happened, and the grandchildren Sarah and Tanner never got to have. They described the nightmare of knowing exactly how their loved ones died, a nightmare that repeated every time Crenshaw's name appeared on a court docket. They pleaded with the court not to prioritize the rehabilitation of a double murderer over the permanent silence of 2 innocent victims. Judge Chuang listened to days of testimony, reviewing the psychological evaluations and the case history. When it came time to render his decision, the courtroom was silent. The judge acknowledged the changes in the law and the necessity of considering Crenshaw's age. He noted the science regarding brain development and the intent of the higher courts to prevent cruel and unusual punishment for those who may have the capacity to change. However, Judge Chuang also emphasized that the law requires a judge to consider the specific circumstances of the crime. He dismantled the defense's argument for leniency by focusing on the deliberate cruelty of the murders. He noted that while Crenshaw was young, the sophistication and brutality of the act went beyond the impulsivity typically associated with youth. The judge pointed out that Crenshaw had killed 2 people who had offered him hospitality, betrayed their trust in the most violent way imaginable, and then took calculated steps to cover his tracks. In the court's view, this was not a crime of immaturity, but a crime of character. Judge Chuang denied the request for a lesser sentence. He ruled that Justin Crenshaw remained a danger to the community and that the severity of the double homicide demanded the maximum penalty allowed by law. He formally reimposed the 2 consecutive sentences of life without the possibility of parole. The ruling meant that, despite the changes in legislation and the passage of time, Crenshaw would die in prison. The reaction from the defendant was immediate and visceral. Throughout the hearing, Crenshaw had maintained a veneer of composure, wearing the mask of the reformed inmate his attorneys had described. He had sat silently, listening to the legal arguments and the weeping of the victims' families. But the moment the judge uttered the finality of the sentence, the mask disintegrated. The transient immaturity the defense had argued for was instantly replaced by a flash of the volatile rage that had defined the 2008 murders. As the reality of the ruling set in that his hope for freedom was extinguished, Crenshaw lashed out. He did not hang his head in remorse or weep for his lost future. Instead, he directed a stream of vitriol at the bench. He shouted at Judge Chuang, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. The outburst was profane and aggressive, culminating in a shocking directive. He screamed, "Don't forget to wipe your ass with that," referring to the judgment paperwork the judge had just signed. The courtroom froze. The outburst was so sudden, so raw, that it stunned the bailiffs and attorneys. It was a moment of absolute clarity that undercut every argument his defense team had made over the previous days. They had spent hours trying to convince the judge that Crenshaw was a changed man, a mature adult who had outgrown his violent past. In a single sentence, Crenshaw proved them wrong. He demonstrated a profound lack of respect for the court, the legal process, and, by extension, the gravity of the lives he had taken. Judge Chuang remained stoic in the face of the abuse, ordering the bailiffs to remove the defendant. As Crenshaw was shackled and dragged from the courtroom, continuing his tirade, the families of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel watched with a mix of horror and vindication. The outburst was traumatic, a final act of violence in a sanctuary of law, but it also served as a dark confirmation. It validated the judge's decision mere seconds after it was made. The man being dragged away was not a rehabilitated youth. He was the same dangerous individual who had entered that house on East Broadway Avenue 17 years prior. The legal outcome of the Justin Crenshaw case was finalized not by the stroke of a pen, but by the defendant's own voice. The reimposition of the life sentences ensured that justice for Sarah and Tanner was upheld, protected from the shifting tides of legislative reform. The 2025 hearing, intended to explore the possibility of redemption, instead provided a stark reminder of the permanence of evil. Crenshaw's final words to the judge became the epitaph of his legal battles, a crude, defiant declaration that ensured his prison cell would remain his home until the end of his days. The system had offered him a second look, a rare opportunity for mercy based on the science of the developing brain, and he had answered it with the same contempt for authority and humanity that had led him to murder in the first place. Of mitigation, based on adolescent brain development, ultimately proved that chronological age does not always correlate with a capacity for change. Instead of demonstrating growth or sorrow, the proceedings highlighted a stagnation of character that terrified those who remembered the brutality of 2008. The legacy of the Justin Crenshaw case is defined not by the legal arguments regarding youthful offenders, but by the absolute clarity provided in those final moments in the courtroom. For the families of Sarah Clark and Tanner Peel, the years between the initial conviction and the 2025 resentencing were marked by a suspended state of grief. The legal system's attempt to apply retroactive leniency forced them to relive the trauma, questioning whether the justice they secured in 2010 would hold. The judge's decision to uphold the 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole brought a definitive end to that uncertainty. The outburst directed at Judge Dean Chuang served as an unintended gift to the prosecution and the families. It stripped away any lingering doubt about whether the man sitting at the defense table had reformed. This case now stands as a grim benchmark in Washington state jurisprudence regarding the Monchka decision. It illustrates the limitations of legislative mercy. While the law sought to account for the malleability of young minds, Crenshaw's conduct proved that some deviations are fixed and dangerous. The community of Spokane is left with the finality that the individual who utilized swords and fire to destroy 2 innocent lives will never walk their streets again. Sarah and Tanner are memorialized not as mere statistics of a violent weekend, but as the catalyst for a legal battle that affirmed the necessity of permanent incarceration for the most extreme offenders. The file is closed, the appeals are exhausted, and the silence of the prison cell has finally replaced the noise of the courtroom.